Okay, I'm going to start with the brachas. I'm going to have you in mind. Have the bracha in mind. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'filu fi Beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzeitzeinu v'tzeitzeimcha Beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishmat. Baruch atah Adonai lomei Torah le'amo Yisrael. Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'cha banu mikol amim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to engross ourselves in the words of your Torah. Please, Adonai, our God, sweeten the words of your Torah in the mouth and in the mouth of your people, the family of Israel. May we and our offspring and the offspring of your people, the house of Israel, all of us know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Blessed art you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to his people, Israel. Amen. Blessed art you, Adonai, God, King of the universe, who selected us from all the people and gave us his Torah. Blessed art you, Adonai, giver of the Torah. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so now we're going to learn a halacha from Kitzur Shulchan Aruch Siman Mim Aleph. Okay. Now, when you're doing hamotzi, the part of the bread that you actually pop in your mouth first as the host must be the choice of bread that is most appetizing to you and is of most interest to you. Okay? Generally, by the way, we learn when we do brachas that there's an order in which we do the brachas. And that is that there's a safek, there's a question as to whether or not we have food that's more of interest to us, or one in terms of a hierarchy of bracha. It's a whole discussion in and of its own. But certainly, there's no discussion as far as the challah is concerned. The host that's doing the bracha is the person that must take the most appetizing piece in his mind. And why do we say in his mind? Some people like the inner soft part, other people like the crust. So everybody's got a different variant taste. Now, what you've got to know is you've got to be sensitive to your guests. If people are older and they've got dentures or they've got receiving gum lines or whatever sort of sensitivity they have, you should give a variety of bread once you cut so that a person can take the piece that suits his taste, his palate, and his physiology. Does that make sense? You have people that are gluten intolerant, etc. I call it the fact of it is that today, with a lot of the refined flours we have, it's not good for everybody. So if you have to have a kazait, it's nice to have a brocha that's made, perhaps in mind, with something that's gluten-free or sugar-free, as well as one that you could take, perhaps like yourself, so that everybody can partake and it doesn't damage them physiologically. One of the things that you've got to bear in mind is there seems to be this like minhag. I don't know if you've seen people that cut a piece of bread. They just cut the knife a bit on the top and then they do a brocha. Okay? I don't know if you've ever seen that. Do you know why they do that?
No, but I've seen people do it.
To designate that bread as being the primary bread of choice.
Okay, so Gavin, that is an interesting reason. Some people do it from a designation point of view. Generally, how it works is the designation works according to how we receive the manna in the desert. So generally, I think, as far as I know, that the Friday night one was on the top and the Saturday one was underneath because you've got a double portion for Shabbos. So I think we do the top one on Friday night and the bottom one on Saturday. I think that's how the designation works.
Well, the other way around.
Is it the other way around, Kev? What came first? Did the Friday night come first and then the Saturday settled on top of it with the manna?
Friday one's on the bottom.
Friday one's on the bottom. Okay. So Kevin, thanks for clearing that up. I didn't know. I knew one of them came first when the manna landed. I didn't know which one came first. So Kevin clarified that. Thanks, Butti. So the Friday night one is below, and then the Saturday one is on top. So therefore, designation is probably not needed. But we might do it generally, as Gavin said, as a custom. One of the reasons for the minhag is that we didn't want to have a hefsek, a delay or a separation between cutting and eating. Remember, all the brachas we've learned, we said that the food cannot be too hot. It takes time to eat, or you have to peel an orange before you do eat. And the same thing with the bread. In those days, the challahs were, you could break your toe if you dropped the challah on your toe. I mean, they didn't exactly have baking powder. So these things were like, have you ever bought that health bread? It looks like what's at the bottom of a bird cage. So that's heavy. It's not light. So that particular thing is heavy. So the knives in those days were not as sharp. So they almost wanted to cut it, but you could only cut partially. Because the minute you cut fully, you're not having a whole loaf. And you need to have 2 whole loaves in Shabbos in order to do the complete bracha. So it's a partial cut. But that's just a minhag. So the main thing to bear in mind is there mustn't be a hefsek, a delay between cutting the bread and eating the bread. It must be as quickly as possible. That's why there's also tradition. Have you seen people break it with their hands?
Yes.
Because that's a hell of a lot easier than playing the violin with a blunt knife, cutting the challah. So,
I think it's the cleverest thing on earth to do it with your hands. It might seem disgusting. It's much quicker, and it takes 2 minutes. And it's the cleverest thing, especially if you've got a big group.
Yeah, as
That's
long
where the
as
expression
somebody,
to break bread comes from,
as
Damon.
long as somebody's washed their hands, I'm happy. So for many reasons.
Yeah.
And you sanitizer.
Correct. But
Break bread.
Oh,
That's what
The bread tastes like alcohol now because there's someone sanitizing your hand.
well, it should be because there's no alcohol sold as of yesterday. So guys,
Yeah, you might have to start drinking your sanitizer. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarity, Kev and Gav. I wasn't, you did add some clarity there that I didn't know. I mean, a lot of people do minhags where they're not sure what they're doing or why they're doing it, but they do it, and there is a reason for it. All right. So let's get into the fact that Gavin brought up a good point yesterday. 2 points that I was thinking about, and I understood why he got there. It means he did do revision. Sometimes it's difficult to understand something, but the fact of it is you're rewarded on the revision. So Gavin was saying that's automatic acquisition of movables when you have a property. Remember you were mentioning that. It's automatic.
Yeah.
A Kinyan Agav, it does mention in that particular case of the fortified cities, in the commentaries, that in that case it was automatic. But it's not always automatic. That's why you have a Kinyan Agav. And because that is mentioned in the Schottenstein art scroll, when you review it at first without reading all the other commentaries, you read it as he automatically acquired the movables along with the seti of etc., etc. So that statement is in there. But if you look at it carefully, the whole reason you have a Kinyan Agav is it's not automatic. You have to have a process, a very quick process, so that it's not foot, toots, and lock, stock, and barrel. Does that make sense, Gavin? But I understand completely where you got it. Meant he did revision, and proper revision.
Yeah, sorry. And I didn't, with all due respect, I did it from the online one. What's it called?
Yeah, they also use
Safari.
that word automatic. But the Kinyan Agav means it's not automatic, because if it was automatic, you wouldn't need a procedure. That's
No, correct.
lot.
No, and you highlighted that to me, and you brought it to my
But
attention.
I understood where you got it. Then Gavin was mentioning the third Bryce, which did add a little bit of clarity, and we're going to get to it today. We're going to do a quick revision of what we did yesterday, and if we cannot have any questions until we just cover a little bit of ground, because what I've worked out today is if we finish the issue of the movables and fixed property with regards to slaves in full, tomorrow we're going to talk about Kotshim, etc. And we've got Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to unroll 12B1, 12B2, and 12B3. Okay, so I'm going to do my best. 12B3 is short, so we're okay in case of an emergency, hopefully. All right. So 12A2, it's going to address the issue that I had yesterday in 12B1 and 12A3. Okay. So let's just go through it quickly. On 12A1, it says the Gemara attempts to relate the dispute between Rav Nachman and Ulla to another earlier dispute. Shall we say that the dispute between Rav Nachman and Ulla is the same as the dispute between these Tanoim? So if one sold slaves and land and a purchaser performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he is not thereby acquired the land. This is on 12A2. Okay, So if a buyer performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has not thereby acquired the land. If he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. If he purchased land and movables, and he performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has thereby acquired the movables. But if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the land. If he was purchasing slaves and movables, and he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has not acquired the movables. And if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the slaves. This brisa seems to rule that slaves are treated as movables. So let's quickly unpack it. If he performs an acquisition, let's use the word acquisition, it's just easy on my tongue, upon the slaves, he has not acquired the land. Why? Because if slaves are treated as movables, you can't acquire the land thereby. That makes sense. If he performs a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. Okay, that seems a little bit difficult to understand, because if slaves are seen legally as movables, according to that first brisa, why can't you acquire the slaves along with the land? So that was my question yesterday, and that's going to be resolved in the third brisa. But if you don't have the question, you never read this brisa properly. That's all I'm saying. Okay, because it doesn't seem to fit in. Because if slaves were regarded as movables, they would automatically be acquired with the land. Yes, so it means there is a question. It doesn't mean that they're not movables. It means there's certain circumstances that they are movables legally, and in certain circumstances, there might need to be another part of the acquisition to go with the land. So we need to see. If he purchased land and movables, he performs a proprietary act upon the land. He is there by acquired the movables. So from there we learn that if you acquire the land, you can acquire the movables with a king and a gov. But if he performs an acquisition upon the movables, he has not acquired the land. So we said, fine, if you got the movables, it's not automatic that you acquire the land. If he was purchasing slaves and movables, he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has not acquired the movables. That makes sense. You can't acquire movables with movables. And if he performs an acquisition act upon the movables, he has not acquired the slaves. Again, you can't acquire movables with movables. So the brisa seems to rule that slaves are treated as movables. And it seems fine, except for that one minor sentence, but the majority of it does seem like it. Now, we've got another brisa that taught. If a man was purchasing slaves and movables, and he performed a proprietary act upon the slaves, he has acquired the movables, which means in the second brisa, that it deems that slaves are seen as, if a slave can acquire movables, what does it seem like according to the second brisa?
That's that.
Yes.
As a movable.
No, in other words, the second brisa, if the buyer performed a proprietary act upon the slave and he has required the movables, it would seem according to the second brisa that slaves are seen as land. So is it not this very point that they argue? In other words, the master of the second brisa holds that slaves are regarded as land, while the other master, the ton of the first brisa, holds that slaves are treated as movables. So that's fairly clear. So the Gemara says that this seems to almost mimic the discussion between Rav Nachman and Rav Ulla, who holds of the opinion of Rav Elazar. Does that make sense? Now, we're saying that maybe that's not where the point of contention actually is between these two nine. So Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, says something very, very clever here, and I want you to hear this. He said it's possible that if you take these two brises, that all the Tanaim agree that slaves are treated as land. Okay, now this is interesting. According to this understanding, the brisa that teaches that one who buys slaves and movables and performs a proprietary act upon the slaves has acquired the movables. So that's in the second brisa. So that's clearly understood to have both brisas seen as land. The second brisa for sure. So we're saying, but hang on, the first one seems like movable. The slaves are seen as movables. How does he see the first one as perhaps that slaves are still seen as land? So the brisa teaches that he has not acquired the movables in such a case, is because that in order to acquire a movable along with the land has to be similar to 45 cities in Judah. So let me just show you, do a screen share with you guys a second. Okay, just let me show you. Okay. Okay, good. I can share my screen. All right. All right, guys. So what he's saying is as follows, is the second brisa, if you want to view slaves seen as land, the second brisa is clear. You acquire, if you have the slaves, you can acquire the movables along with it. That's clear. He said, but the first brisa, where it seems that you can't, what's it talking about the case here? He said, legally, slaves are still seen as land. But in order for land to acquire movables, it's not a proof against slaves being halachically seen as land. It's a case of the fact that in order to acquire movables, something else is required. And what is required? That land does not move. If you look at 26a in Kedushin, for where's this matter derived? Chizkiah said of the verse, and their fathers gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things with fortified cities in Judah. So this indicates that he gave them movable items together with cities. He need not give them the items to them directly, as he was able to transfer by means of the cities he gave them. So what's it saying is that the problem with slaves in this particular case is what? Is that they're movable. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. They're not fortified.
They're not fortified. So he's saying it doesn't mean that slaves are seen necessarily as movables, and that's why they can't acquire the land. It's because slaves move around. And therefore, in order to have the criteria of the king and the gov, the land cannot move. Does that make sense? And that's from Chronicles chapter 21, verse 3. That's where Kedushin 26a gets it from. Now, the laws, by the way, in terms of the king and the gov, it says property that serves as a guarantee. What does it mean as a guarantee? Is that fixed property or land that are fixed on the earth can be acquired by money, by a document, or by taking possession of it. Now, why is it determined as a guarantee? Because you can have a lien on land. Land's not going anywhere. People move on the land. People use the land, but the land ain't disappearing in one's pocket. It can't be used up and it can't disappear and be sold under somebody's nose. So therefore, it can work as a lien against either that grade of land or that land in particular. Movable property is not that easy. And property that does not serve as a guarantee, what does that mean? It means movable property because there's no lien against it, can be acquired along with property that serves as a guarantee by means of giving money, by means of a document, or by means of taking possession of them. That's why, Gavin, I was saying a king and a gov is not just straightforward automatic acquisition. You still have to do some sort of particular activity. So I hope I've made this clear, guys, so far. So that's a very interesting look in it. So then Rav Ika explains that the ton of the first brisa holds that movables can only be acquired together with land if that land is similar to the land mentioned in the source verse, that it doesn't move. Now, this is a very interesting different angle on it. There are those who say that Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, said the opposite. He's saying that it's possible that all the Tanoim actually agree that slaves are treated as movables. So now we've got to shift our thinking. So what is it saying here? Is that according to this understanding, the first brisa makes sense. Why? Because the first brisa clearly says that if you acquire the slave, you have not acquired the movables. Movables can't acquire the movables. Does that make sense? But the second brisa needs a bit of an understanding, because what does it say in the second brisa? Is that if you acquire the slaves, you can acquire the movables. So then it would seem that the slaves are like land. So what do you mean that the movables in the second brisa can acquire movables? And that's what we touched on yesterday, that if the slave is wearing jewelry, and jewelry is not a fixed asset, it's a movable asset, or is wearing a leather fur coat, or whatever the case may be of his master, it's physically located on the slave. Okay? So what is it known as then? It's known as a chatzir. chatzer, like Rabbi Meir. It's known as one's courtyard. So what do we mean by one's courtyard? Is that it's in your own, it's on you. It's on your own domain. It's in your property. It's on your property. Does that make sense? So the chatzir is the term of one's courtyard. In other words, it's only movables that are on the slave as a movable that are counted. If it's not attached to the slave, you can't attach movables to movables that are not attached. Does that make sense? So kinyan nagav is when you take land and you attach movables using kinyan nagav. And a movable that attaches a movable is only if that movable thing is attached to that other movable thing. And that's called a chatzer, which is one's courtyard. Okay. And this is mentioned in a couple of sources. In Exodus chapter 22, verse 3, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, it's brought in Bava Kamma 10b to 11a. And as far as I know, it's also in Gittin, where is it? I think it's 77a. Okay? So you can check up all the sources afterwards. And it's talking about two cases where this happens. It talks about if something comes into someone's hand, either in the case of a divorce, like a settlement, or in the case of a thief's hand. It comes into their hand quite literally, like somebody's receiving a bill of divorce, or a theft where somebody grabs something of their hand. So it's in their hand, and they've increased their value. So it's a pun on the word. Does that make sense, guys? So also, when they use the term, it comes into one's hand, why does it use that term? Apart from the pun of increasing your wealth and obviously having it in your actual physical hand, is that a hand, even if you're movable, is part of you. What do we mean? No matter where you go, unless you're an amputee, your hand goes with you. You can get on a plane to Germany, your hand comes with you. You're in South Africa, your hand goes with you. So you are movable, but if your hand is attached to the movable, your hand is fixed in respect to you, even though your hand moves. Does that make sense, guys? So that's why chatzer is known as coming into one's hand. All right, that's fine. So we're on 12a3, and Rava challenges this because Rava turns around and says this doesn't make sense for one reason. If you have a movable that's stationary at the time and you apply another movable upon it, that's fine. But the whole nature of a slave is that a slave can travel. He's moving. So a courtyard has to be fixed. So a traveling courtyard cannot affect acquisition for its owner. So if you say that Bryson speaks of a case where the slave is standing still, Rava said it doesn't make sense because he might be standing still at that moment, but he still cannot serve as an acquisition while he's traveling because he has the potential to travel. In other words, even if he's standing still or sitting at that moment, he has the potential to travel. And therefore, to put items on him and tell him to stand still, it's not valid. Unless one thing happens. Rava said that in that case, the slave has to be bound to a fixed position. In other words, you have to tie him up. Okay? In other words, put stuff on him, tie him up and do the procedure. And Tosfot says one more than that, is that he also has to be sleeping when the movables are required. Because a chatzir must be guarded at the behest of his owner, and the slave, when awake, is one guarding himself. All right. So this is Rashi and Gittin 77b. So before we get complicated and go on to different discussions, just remember one thing in mind very, very clearly, is that a movable can attach a movable if it's in a fixed position and if it's on that movable item directly. Okay? Before we go on, does everybody understand so far? It's pretty clear.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. The Gemara arrives at its final understanding of Rav Ikka's resolution. So it's starting to, and the law is stated in the second brisa that a slave can function as a courtyard is only correct when the slave is bound. In such a case, the slave can indeed be used as a courtyard since he's unable to travel. But another brisa taught, if this is the third brisa, Gavin, you were mentioning, right?
Yeah.
That if one was purchasing land and slaves, and the buyer performed a proprietary act upon the land, he has acquired the slaves. This contradicts the ruling of the first brisa that rules that slaves are not acquired in such a case. Remember, that was the problem that I brought. Because the first brisa says, if a buyer creates a proprietary act upon the land, he has not acquired the slaves. And I said, if slaves are seen as movable, why can't you acquire the slaves with the land? And this third brisa is coming to solve my resolution, because it also picked up on the problem. And it says, what's this case of the third brisa? That when it's talking about the first brisa, the slaves were not standing in the field at the time. When it's talking about the second brisa, the slaves were in the field at the time. Does that make sense? So the slaves, in order to be acquired with the land, even though they're movable, have to be on the property. Okay? And there are two reasons given. We've got like 10 minutes left. So even if I explain this in more detail next time, I just want to give you the two reasons. So according to the opinion that slaves are movable, that first brisa, that one question has a problem. Because you should be able to acquire the slaves when you acquire the land. So we're saying in that first brisa, it's a case where the slaves were not standing on the land, and the slaves have to stand on the land as movables in order to acquire them. In the second brisa, they were standing on the land, therefore they were acquired. Okay, that makes sense. So what we're saying then is we're saying, okay, but then there seems to be another problem. And what's that other problem? Is that if you want to view a slave, why can't you, according to the other brisa, you're going to have another problem. So what's the other problem is, remember when we said that you can't, when you've got a slave, you can't acquire land. So that makes sense. If you're saying that the slave is immovable, you can't acquire land, that makes sense. But if you want to say a slave is land, and then you can't acquire land. We discussed the city of Judah in Kiddushin 26, 8. And the reason why we said it is that lands, although they're separate, you can acquire different lands that are not attached to each other. So what we're saying here, let me just put it in the most simple way, is that for you to acquire lands in different countries, even though they're not attached to each other, you can do it because land is seen as one land mass amongst the earth. In other words, if you look at topography, the earth is 2/3 water, and continents don't float. Continents and the earth's core is made out of volcanic rock that has cooled down from the earth's core, and that the water is filled within those cavities. Are you with me? And they cover 2/3 of the world. So if you buy 10 pieces of land in 10 different countries, even if you make an acquisition on the one piece of land, you can still make an acquisition on the 9 other pieces of land. Why? Because all lands are connected via the earth. But if you want to see slaves legally as land, and you make an acquisition on a slave as though he were land, you can't acquire another piece of land unless that land is physically touching a slave. So if you want to see a slave as land, and you acquire the slave, then in certain cases, it doesn't have to be like the fixed city of Judah. He has to just be residing on the land at which you're purchasing. Then when you acquire the slave, if it's seen in the position of land, you acquire that land. In the case where the brises where we see a slave as land. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions? Yeah. Michael?
No, it's fine. No, listening.
You use the word residing as opposed to tied up, which makes more sense.
No. They're two different cases. The one where they're tied up is when it's a chatzir, it's a courtyard. So that is a case when you acquiring a movable and immovable. So in the case where you're seeing a slave as immovable, according to that one brisa, you can't acquire a movable with a movable. It's only when it's on the slave's physical person that it's attached to him like a hand attached to a body, because he's wearing the fur coat, he's wearing the jewelry. But in that case, the slave cannot move because a movable, it's a different sort of movable to a movable. In other words, you might have, for example, let's take a bakkie, Gavin, not a bakkie. Let's take let's take a bakkie. A bakkie is stationary until you start it and drive away with it. But it's seen as a movable asset. Are you with me? So all the rubble that's in the bakkie, you can acquire when you acquire a bakkie, because although it's a movable, acquiring a movable through a chatzir, through a courtyard, the bakkie can't move until you start it. But a slave can move of its own volition. Does that make sense? So therefore, a slave has to be bound. That's a case when a movable can acquire a movable through the law of chatzir, through the law of a courtyard. But when it's like a kinyan agav, where land acquires land, it's a different case. And that's where we talk about physically adjacent to each other or connected either from the land mass of the earth, or a slave that's seen as land in that halachic case, standing upon land that you wish to acquire through the slave.
Okay, so is the slave standing on the land, or is he residing on the land, living on that land?
It suffices that I think you're right in that he would. It would make sense that if he has some attachment to the land emotionally, that he works on the land or he lives on the land. But the reality is, even if he lives on the land, if he's not standing on the land during that act of acquisition, it doesn't count. Does that make sense? That's the bottom line. It's a physical act of those two different objects that are halachically considered land as being attached to each other physically, whether it's two physical properties joined by land mass, or a slave that's seen as land halachically attached to physical land by standing on it.
And then does it work both ways? So if you acquire the slave and he's standing on that land, he's considered land, and you can acquire acquisition of the other land.
Yes,
of the actual land itself.
Yeah,
and the other way around as well.
Yes, but correct, both ways. Okay, so I know this seems confusing, but it's not that unclear. There's kinyan agav, where you get the movables along with land, and then you have chatzir, which is you acquire movable along with the movable, as long as it's attached to that movable, like rubble in a bakkie, or fur coat and diamond rings on a slave. Does that make sense? Okay, it's fairly clear. I think we're almost done. I want to thank you guys very, very much. I'll see you tomorrow and do the last part of this brisa clearly, and have a great day.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks, guys.
Okay,
cheers. Thanks.
Cheers. See you guys tomorrow.